Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you all to a professional luncheon at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan with our distinguished guest, Dr. Edward Luttwak, a professional strategist. Before I proceed any further, although I would like to ask you all to turn your cell phones to silent mode or turn them off. And in case of an emergency, please note the exit where our charming Ms. Chung is standing there. Dr. Luttwak is one of those people who really doesn't need much of an introduction, but you should note that he is a professional strategist who actually makes a living by giving advice on strategy to corporations and to governments. And his visit here this time was to do a series of workshops for Japanese government, for the Japanese government. He is listened to, and that is attested to the fact that this week he met with Prime Minister Abe. His most recent books are The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy, which has been translated into Japanese as Jimetsuru Taikoku Chugoku, Naze Sekai Teikoku ni Narenai. And another one is Strategy, the Logic of War and Peace, which is translated in Japanese as Senryakuron. Dr. Luttwak was born in Arad, which is in present-day Romania. He was brought up in Italy, educated in Britain and the United States, and has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He has also written a series of books on strategy, the strategy of the Roman Empire, the Soviet Empire, and most recently the Byzantine Empire. I will just leave it at that, and I'd like to ask Dr. Luttwak to give us his views on recent events and developments in this part of the world, where he is not a stranger. He has been to Japan many, many times, China many times as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I should explain that a strategist is not somebody who goes around making pronouncements. Wise men say, do this, do that. It's just that there is such a thing as the logical strategy, which never tells you the whole story, but it does really tell you something when there is conflict, or people are preparing for conflict, people are fearing conflict, anticipating conflict. Then there is the paradoxical logic of strategy, of course, because you cannot be just straightforward. Every move you make, you have to expect somebody will react. If you act thinking that the other side doesn't exist and that it'll do nothing, you are autistic, like an autistic child. It is the property of very big countries to be somewhat autistic. And Japan is the neighbor of the biggest country, also a country that is extremely busy. If you are 7 members of the Politburo handling 2 or 3 earthquakes, floods, riots, major problems, scandals, corruption, investigations on any one day, plus they are dealing with a large number of neighbors, some of which are not quiet neighbors, and they have now activated the neighborhood by starting territorial quarrels with all these countries. So the ability to actually process information from outside is rather limited. As for Xi Jinping, is even more limited, because part of their not understanding their own condition as living in international life is that a lot of foreign affairs behavior is nothing to do with foreign affairs, namely the daily arrival in Beijing of the delegation from Vanuatu, Kiribati, Uruguay, whatever, all of which are received the same way, with full honors, And they're given the gift, and they bring the gift, and there's this conversation, and the Chinese tell them what economic program they want to do, what investment, or could be, or maybe, whatever, and, high-speed rail. The island of Palau doesn't have much use for high-speed rail, but maybe you still offer them something. So this kind of para-activity, which is not really diplomacy. It is a ceremonial thing that takes the time allocated for foreign policy. So Japan has this strange neighbor who is like a very fat man who enters an elevator. And he's very fat. And even if he was very nice, there'd be a bit of a problem because there's really no room. But actually, he's getting fatter all the time because he's growing at 7.5% per year, maybe 7%. It will go down to 6%. Is the normal process. High-speed growth ended in Japan as it ended in Europe. It will end there too. But still, he's still a very fat man entering the elevator, and he's still growing rather fast. So people are squeezed against the walls. So even if he was super nice and very apologetic, say, I'm very, very sorry, that's the way things are, I'm growing, you're being squeezed, things will be great. But actually, as you all know, after fully spelling out the peaceful rise policy, the policy of not threatening, not asking, not challenging, just peacefully rising, the policy that attracted goodwill from all over the world, for reasons mysterious, I have my theory, you probably have yours, suddenly, rather suddenly, they changed. They revived a territorial quarrel with India over Arunachal Pradesh. That's the former Northeast Frontier Agency. That is Northeast India. That is the piece of territory above the Brahmaputra River to Tibet, a kind of oblique state, plus on the other side, Ladakh, and so on. They strongly revived the maritime quarrel with Vietnam. They opened a brand new quarrel with Malaysia over the South China Sea, did the same with Indonesia over the Natuna offshore, again, South China Sea, of course, with the Sultan of Brunei, which is a particularly dangerous thing to do because he could invade China anytime, with his battalion of Gurkhas. And since they don't know how big China is, they would definitely be willing to go, They're the famous Gurkhas who were asked to become paratroopers, and they were very worried, but still they were getting ready. And then it was explained to them that they wouldn't just jump from the airplane, have a parachute. So the Sultan of Brunei with his Gurkhas is getting ready to do it. Anyway, he invited me there. I'm on my way to Brunei, so fully expect to be planning the invasion of China. Then, of course, he also quarreled with the Philippines in a big way and claiming territory there, and Senkaku Islands. Although my good friend Luo Yuan in Beijing opposes talking about Senkaku because he wants Okinawa and the Ryukyus. So first, they raised these subjects in various ways. Like, for example, Asian Development Bank stops a loan to India on the grounds that this is not Indian territory because that particular little road or bridge was in Arunachal Pradesh. Then they sort of declare it. Then they start moving with boats and ships and aeroplanes. Then they do proclamatory actions like the proclamation of the air defense zone. And in regard to Malaysia, they had a particular problem because the Malaysian government is not a terribly dynamic, active, or awake government. So eventually they had to do they did a ceremony aboard a Chinese warship in which these naval officers dedicated themselves to the defense forever of the sacred piece of China, which was a piece of water. They didn't have even a rock to put the flag on, so ceremony on board, and then they broadcast it on CCTV, including CCTV in English. And they did it until the Malaysians noticed. When they noticed, they opened a dispute with Malaysia. In other words, this fat man, who's getting fatter, has also started quarreling with all the people on one side of the elevator. At the same time, they have settled on very generous terms, conceding 50, 60, 70, even 90% of the territorial disputes with all the countries to the east. That is, with Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzia, Tajikistan. With Russia, they negotiate 4,000 kilometers of complicated border. And so on one side, the continental side settled all the disputes, neutralized any threat that, for example, people from Central Asia would support the Uyghur in their struggle, but concurrently, simultaneously started quarrels with everybody from India around Japan. Now, this behavior cannot be explained by any form of strategic analysis. This is how history moves, when very intelligent people do very stupid things. But you think they're stupid, somebody else can say they're stupid, but for them, maybe compulsory. Maybe compulsory. Maybe what goes on in China is a kind of infernal machine that public opinion now has rice, can eat rice, and therefore it's a time to bring up all the humiliation and they put away for 150 years. It's coming up. Public opinion demands violent behavior towards, they wouldn't demand it, by the way, against the Indians, because they don't consider the Indians, they're convinced that the Indians are zeros, corrupt, dirty income. But they certainly demanded vis-a-vis Japan and the United States to a lesser degree, as United States actually substituting for the missing players, which are the other powers, the British, the French, the Germans, all of which claim pieces of China, but all of whom are now absent, but the Americans are not. So public opinion. Secondly, sideways pressure. That is the Army, Navy, Air Force, Defense, whatever, wanting more money and so on. By the way, recently I was visiting their General Staff headquarters. They have a new building. The new building makes the Ritz-Carlton in Roppongi look very humble. And they also gave dinner in a guest house, which makes the even more humble. Billion-dollar buildings. The military have money to build billion-dollar buildings to replace perfectly adequate, if somewhat oldish, prior buildings they have. So, and then top-down, if you're Xi Jinping, if you're standing committee, you have less and less communism, so you replace it with nationalism. So Japan is facing a country which is pursuing a very bad foreign policy, not because they're stupid, but because they're autistic, of course, like all great powers, and don't really know what's going on, and has to deal with it. Now, the Japanese government, as you know, as all of you will understand, the way conflict goes, and you've seen countries, the logical strategy is stronger than politics. The logical strategy is much stronger than politics. That's why even when Mr. Singh was the prime minister in India, and now Mr. Modi, who has all kinds of ideas, the Indians started helping the Vietnamese. Today's paper shows a picture of the Vietnamese prime minister in Delhi, officializing it with Modi, who's consciously doing it. But before, when there was Singh, who was uninterested, still they offered training for the Vietnamese to operate their new submarines, making a huge difference. And the previous Japanese government already started to offer ships to the Philippines. And in other words, if you threaten a bunch of countries all at the same time, you are basically creating an alliance against yourself. Chinese threats generate an alliance response. First, people try to reinforce themselves, to increase their ability to operate. In the case of Japan, obviously, to remove things like collective security, obstacles to collective security, and so on. You do low-cost things like that, then you start building a little more force, but then you really do alliance. And the alliance comes in organically. The only exception to organic and natural was the Australians, because the Australians been analyzing this strategically. The Australians are extremely strategically oriented. They're also Anglo-Saxon people in politics, at any rate, whatever the population might be, and therefore they're very aggressive and violent. As you know, the Australians go looking for wars 12,000 miles from their country and eagerly participate, in Afghanistan, Iraq, whatever it is. So therefore, being strategic-minded, the Australian government anticipated all this, and we now have successive Australian prime ministers going around to these countries saying, you need to be allied. And they are very important because they bring in the Malaysians. They still have an operating base at Butterworth in Malaysia with Australian officers and some. They bring in the Malaysians. They manage the Indonesians as well. And of course, they've been focusing big time on Tokyo and so on and so forth. So you have Americans and Australians supporting this, the Tokyo end. You have the Indians still maintaining a strong connection with Russia. And Russia may be inclined the other way, but still the Russians are supplying their highest technology to India and not to China. If India and China buy the same aircraft, the Indians get the version with more radar capability. The Chinese have their own abilities, but still. So what we have here is an emerging Asian alliance, and it's an alliance, therefore, when you have a prime minister like Abe-san, who happens to be whatever his other virtues or defects or shortcomings might be, he happens to be a strategic-minded person. Somebody, for example, who's been cultivating Modi for years and who understands all that stuff, then he becomes smoother and faster. And actually, you can have leadership. The Abe speech of the Shangri-La dialogue was a leadership action. The result is the Malaysians, for the first time, came out publicly and said, yes, we have a dispute with China, and we're going down. And the Indonesians reacted very strongly. After years of saying that they're not part of this, suddenly the Indonesians came out with a statement saying, our territorial integrity is threatened. The location is the offshore Natuna, and so we said, we're sending armed helicopters to Natuna with anti-ship missiles. The next time the Chinese ships try to disturb our operations there, we will sink them. Now, why did they say that? Well, because for years they're trying to avoid it, then they got this leadership signal and so on. So what's happening here is a transformation of policy, and all along, the aim of this alliance is not to destroy China, but to destroy itself. Because if the alliance becomes strong enough, it becomes strong enough and really very strong, the Chinese can destroy the alliance immediately by simply going back to peaceful rise. Pre-2004, go back to peaceful rise, stop threatening people, and then we are back to the other China, which exists every day, which is the China which is the best market for General Motors, China where Nissan and Toyota are working hard to increase market share, the China which is generating a lot of tourism, which has tourism, sends tourism, a China that has 95% positive on the commercial side, and therefore totality, let's say 50% positive minimum, if not more. So that is what's going on here. The more Japan is strategic, the more these other countries are successful, the stronger this new Asian power is, the more likely is that autism will be overcome and all the other factors will be overcome, and they go back to peaceful rise. But in the meantime, there are big problems. And the big problem is exactly autism. If you follow the Vietnamese story, you remember the story that they sent the oil drilling rig off the coast of Vietnam. So they sent it, and then the Vietnamese sent 30 boats to push them away. The Chinese sent 60 boats. And the Chinese, having decided that Vietnam is a country that you can push around, it's a country that you can threaten and frighten, they said, we're going to win because we sent 60, they don't have 120. Well, they don't have 120, so they went and started burning Chinese-owned factories, killing Chinese people on the streets. And in other words, they're the neighbors of Vietnam, but they have never heard of, they know nothing about Vietnam, nothing. They know as much about Vietnam as they know about southern Patagonia. because they believed that the Vietnamese would be intimidated. The wrong people to intimidate. You know, they defeated the Americans, they defeated the French. They believe, they're convinced it's not true, they defeated Genghis Khan. Okay? And so their attitude to China is the Chinese bother them enough, they will invade China. But the Chinese don't know this. So this is the big issue. They will take a long time for them to know there's going to be, that the alliance even exists. And that is the situation, that's the context, and voila, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think you've really lifted the veil, and the scales are off our eyes. Thank you very much. We will be taking questions from the working press first. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Identify yourself by name and organization. And we would like to have questions, one question per person per time, and no speeches, please. Thank you. Okay. Yes. Okay.
My name is Crowell. I represent Anadolu Agency. And my question concerns the upcoming APEC meeting, where the Japanese are pushing very hard for a productive meeting with Mr. Xi. Do you think the Japanese would be wise to bend a little on their official stance that there's no dispute over the Senkaku Islands and hope for something from the Chinese, like a promise not to send any more Coast Guard cutters into their territorial waters?
The Chinese aim, according to this whole theory, the Chinese aim is not to invade or start a war with Japan or any other country. They want to intimidate countries into accepting Chinese supremacy. And in fact, they say, if Japan accepts Chinese supremacy, we will open the Chinese market to Japan, Japanese companies, everybody will benefit. All you have to do are small things like don't give a visa to the Dalai Lama, stop the security treaty with the United States, get the Americans out of the bases in Japan. So that is, and then you'll be happy ever after, fully independent and so on, and you do whatever you want within those limits and so on. So what they want from Japan is only an act of submission. So if you give them an act of submission, it's much better not to have the meeting. Because either this is going to be a meeting where the Chinese basically face the reality of Japan, that Japan is not on its way to becoming a loyal member of what the Japanese call Tenka, and the Chinese call Tiansha, the all under heaven. In other words, you cannot fiddle this meeting. Obviously, Japan wants a meeting with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping could have said, no, I'm not going to meet him unless he promises never to visit the Yasukuni Shrine and agrees to put Senkaku in dispute. Okay? So you could do that if you said things like, we agree so long as Xi Jinping apologizes for the murders of Mao Zedong and is willing to put in dispute something else. But the point is this, the game here is to submit Japan, that's all. There are no war plans, no nothing. So what you'd be buying in exchange will be assurance of non-aggression. In history, people have done that. You don't want to have somebody attacking you. But in this case, there ain't no Chinese attack. There's no military planning there. So the only purpose would essentially be a diplomatic error, I believe.
My name is Hiro Krishna, and I'm with the Kokumin Shimbun, editor-writer. This is a typical media question. I'd like to clarify the facts When Prime Minister Abe visited Yasukuni Shrine, December last year, U.S. State Department announced that they are disappointed. But is it true that that statement neither reflect the President Obama's viewpoint or nor the U.S. government?
Well, fortunately, I'm not the U.S. ambassador, who I understand is a charming lady who will be happy to answer your question. All I can say is that comments about the Yasukuni Shrine will be matters of interest to a handful of specialists in Washington who know how to spell Yasukuni Shrine, or at least think they know. The concern, as you well know, in the United States, and is that the United States is in a power balancing situation with China. It has enormous military advantage over China today. It has less of an enormous advantage when you take into account the whole economic sphere and every other sphere. And therefore, Japan is the ally that is the #1 ally, certainly in Asia, probably in the world. So when you have a #1 ally, you focus on important things, and that's not an important thing. Now, if they want to make a statement about this, they can make a statement, but clearly when Obama travels to Japan, the only important statement he made was the statement that the Senkaku, Senkaku Islands are fully covered by the treaty in force. The 1960 version of the security treaty encompasses the Senkaku Islands. That was the only statement that has strategic significance. That's all.
Eric Slavin with Stars and Stripes. There seems to be a lot of concern in some circles that the rebalance to the Pacific that the U.S. has proposed won't happen to the extent that they're saying it will, given the issues with the Middle East and so forth. Is what the U.S. is doing now sufficient to, I guess, back up that alliance that you're speaking of, or does more need to be done? And is there the possibility of the Middle East sort of taking the U.S.'s eye off the ball?
Well, there is a kind of, there's a fake answer to this. The fake answer is that from a military point of view, the United States is so vastly superior to China, it will continue to be in 10, 15 years, that no distraction could make a difference. There is a sub-fake answer as well, which is that all of the military action in Mesopotamia, given the fact that the Dawlat al-Islamiyya of the Islamic State presents very few targets, of the very small air power, which is in the Gulf actually, it is employed at the rate of 4 aircraft maximum in 24-hour cycle. So you have the United States, a country with many airplanes using 4. So there's a large fake answer and a small fake answer. The very sad answer, which is very depressing to me since I'm given my profession, is that President Obama had made a very wise decision, from my point of view, to not do anything in Syria and not do anything in Iraq. And when the 4 expensively equipped, expensively trained Iraqi divisions with tanks, self-propelled artillery, armored personal carriers, a lot of supporting infrastructure simply collapsed, that was the triumphant justification for Obama's view that everything you do in the Middle East will never amount to anything. You can spend as much as you want. So unfortunately, what next happened was that, as you know, they got these 2 guys and put orange T-shirts on them, filmed them very beautifully against the gray desert background, whereupon the President of the United States was mau-mau'd by the press, the Congress, by the assorted blowhards, that he has to do something. Now, these guys sent an invitation to the United States. Now, if I invite you to meet, I'm a known gangster and killer, and I invite you to meet me behind the railway station at 3 in the morning, you don't say, oh, yeah, let's go. And other people saying, you're not going fast enough. You should go more, right? They're doing it for a reason. They're doing it not specifically to entangle the United States, but they're doing it to entangle the Saudis, because that was Osama bin Laden's target, bring down the Saudi royal family, which had enriched this family enormously, but annoyed him personally. They're very annoyed with the Saudis. So the Americans rush in, because as you know, 100 think tanks in Washington, CIA, State Department, nobody is asking the question, why did they send us the invitation? Why were we invited to Mesopotamia? Was it for our own good? They didn't simply ask the question. If you study strategy, you ask that question. Why? They didn't. So Obama was mau-maued into it, and yes, it's a huge distraction. Why? Because one thing leads to another. Now it's only 4 airplanes, you know, on average day, it's about 4 sorties, 5 sorties. But one thing is linked to another. Next thing you know, black flags start popping up in Riyadh and Jeddah and Dhahran next to that tube on which they unload 8 million barrels a day. Yes. And the Chinese, of course, are extremely happy. I mean, just because they made a beautiful video, the color was so well done. So this is, you know, I say the Chinese are autistic, and they are dumb enough not to know what Vietnam is. And then you can say, yes, the American system, even though there was this cautious and wise president who didn't want to do anything, which is always the right thing to do in the Middle East, nothing. Anyway, sorry about this.
I think you have at least one story out of that. Okay, go ahead. So.
Nice to see you again. Oh, hi. How are you? Takashi Koi, I'm a freelance. I'd like to ask you a question on the Middle East. Which country in the Middle East do you think is the most important player today? And do you think the situation is going to change dramatically during the coming 2 or 3 years?
Well, actually, that's a very interesting question, because for several years now, the think tanks, analysts, and the media have propagated this fantasy notion of Turkey as an important country, Turkey as a powerful country, okay? Just because it has 1 million men in uniform and has all the appearances of being powerful, it is exactly the same as the 4 Iraqi armored divisions. See, with that equipment, and by the way, that level of individual training, you'll be able to conquer Western Europe with 4 armored divisions. And they were able to dissolve in the front of the city of Mosul, okay? So who are the players in this collection of people who can do something? Assad has been able to remain in power. In spite of the fact that everybody and his brother are against him, he remains in power. By the way, the Turks have 700-kilometer border with Syria. The Turkish Erdogan stood on his hind legs in his Armani suit to say that Assad has to leave within 3 days of the civil war. He has to go. And then they've done nothing, of course, because that's all they can do. So Assad has some power. The Jordanians have some power because they retain some integrity and control. The Israelis obviously have different kinds of power. Hamas has a little power, and other players don't have power. The Turks have none. The Iraqi state doesn't exist. The Shia militias exist. Shia leadership exists, but the state does not exist. It is a fantasy. And then there's the Iranians, who are able to do things like support the Assad and so on, and therefore they have some power too. But basically, it's a spectacle of impotence all around. These are non-functioning entities.
Just let me remind you that the questioning at the moment is restricted to working press. And so who would like to, can you please raise your hand? Are you a member of the working press? Okay, please. Thank you.
They just put me there because I didn't have lunch. My name is Rudolf ten Hoed. I'm an energy reporter. I cover Asian energy markets for European energy media. So, driven by energy, Russian dependence on China seems to go on the rise. Where do you see that development going? And on the second place, would that make China even more bold in, let's say, the South China Sea?
Well, I did note that even before the recent developments, Chinese autism wasn't so complete that they would quarrel also eastwards. They quarrel with everybody from India, Japan to India, but they carefully avoided any quarrels with the Russians. If you're historical minded, you might even, give some weight to the fact that the Chinese and the Russians have always had very tightly controlled situations when they were fighting within limits and so on. So there's a particular relationship. Everybody in Russia knows that what makes Russia a world power is Siberia. Without Siberia, Russia is 2.5 Polands. And also everybody in Russia knows and thinks about is that Siberia is undergoing depopulation and that the city of Shenyang in China has more people than live east of Tomsk. And so this is a very long-term concern. But in the current situation, that is long-term, which means that don't see a strategic alliance developing of the kind that Japan and the United States have, right? But ongoing cooperation, yes. Now, if Western Europe had reacted to the Ukrainian and so on, the taking of Crimea by Putin, which was the action of somebody who was not at all autistic and knows strategy and knows how to take a whole country, put it in his pocket, right? If Europe had reacted by passing European rules to stop the plague of environmental NGOs, this stinking infectious plague of blocking every project and allowing the 40 different regasification plants to be built in Western Europe, that would emancipate Europe from any gas imports because of the available, there's orphan gas all over the world not being shipped right now because of lack of regasification in Europe, because of projects blocked by environmental groups and so on. If the European Union had reacted to this it's like saying my grandmother had wheels, she would be a car, right? If the European Union was a functioning geopolitical entity, they would have destroyed the gas market for the Russians, oil market for the Russians to some degree, and then the Chinese would have been advantaged and negotiated an even worse price from the Russian point of view. But this did not happen. Instead, there is absolutely no desire to do anything that will diminish dependence. And then it's going to be a numbers game because U.S. gas at $4 for a million cubic feet, $2 to put it on the ship, then $1 across, $1 to regasify, that sets an 8 million cubic feet level for Gazprom, and on that, they can do very well. And therefore, I don't believe the Chinese will have them. And besides, the last negotiation, the big negotiation between Russians and Chinese on gas was a very bad result for the Chinese because the Chinese got an excessively good price. So suddenly the Russians view China not as an alternative buyer, but as the buyer of last resort. That changed the perceptions. Japan could be the buyer. One of Abe-san's strategic actions is, in spite of everything, to try and improve relations with Russia. And buying gas, when the Japanese buy gas, it's different because that's part of maintaining the functionality of Siberia because that's where the gas comes from. And it is a common American interest, Japanese interest, to keep Siberia not Chinese. Because China plus Siberia is technically, becomes geographically the largest country in the world, which you can all say is unimportant. After all, Argentina is very big, and it is not important. But in this case, China plus Siberia means China to the Arctic. It means China as world power, and the game is over. So in all of this complex, the energy plays a key role because of the anomaly that Russia, the largest European nation under Russians, and because of the way they're governed, they depend on oil and gas exports as if they were Abu Dhabi.
Okay, I'm having difficulty seeing hands, so if you want to ask a question, please raise it fairly high. Yes, thank you.
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. You called Mr. Abe a kind of a strategic thinking man. But is not in this kind of thinking a kind of autism? Because he cannot see what the outside world think about Japan's dealing with the past. It's, I think, not acknowledging what the outside world thinks about one's doing. It means this is a kind of autism, I think.
Well, you know, every political leader in the world that I know has a support base of people who really support him. 52% or 72% or 80% can vote for him. But then he has a support base. These are the people who are with him in the bad year. They're with him when he loses power and continue to support him. And this group evidently have very strong beliefs about that stuff. And that is this limitation in international affairs. Because, of course, Germany was a country that showed how you achieve a historical reconciliation. And Germany did it in particular circumstances. And, from a strategic point of view, you could say, for example, that it is a one-sided Japanese interest to do everything possible to reconcile with the Koreans, let's say, no matter what the Koreans do. The Koreans engage in provocations, some atrocious provocations. The Hito Hirobumi assassin memorial in the Harbin station is an atrocious provocation, given that the assassin killed a particularly nice guy. But it's still, you could say, a strategic point of view, that the Japanese attitude should be to be super nice to the Koreans at all times, and when they are very bad, to be even nicer, because it is an unambiguous Japanese interest from every strategic point of view. But that may not be, possible. Every politician has his limits. Obama has his own limits because of his particular support base, and will do things that to you will appear very silly and stupid, but actually a political imperative. And that's the political imperative on Abe. So even if Abe personally didn't care a damn about any of this, he will be politically obliged to do it, like all political leaders are to do it. That's why it's not a subject of conversation in the room called strategy. There is other rooms called, ethics, morality, historical, whatever. But the Japanese have had the example of Germany before them all these years, of what Germany did and how they did it and how was the approach and what was the result. And, but they've had their own requirements, and that's the way it goes in politics. When you engage in strategic business, you're not a priest, you're not a moralist, you're not a preacher, and you're not the wise man say. You try to operate within the parameters and constraints of the situation.
Thank you. Do I see any more hands from the working press? Okay, since there's no hands from the working press, I'll open the floor to those who would like to ask a question from any category.
Anyone else?
Anyone else? Yes, okay.
But is it working?
My name is Ito, and I belong to Mitsubishi All Transport, the shipping company. I want to know about your view about the present Hong Kong. How are the Chinese going to settle this Hong Kong issue? And then are they going to transform present Hong Kong as a part of China? What is going to be the process? That is one thing. And then after Hong Kong, what's your view about Taiwan next?
Anything else?
I'm sure that you have seen or can easily see interviews with very hip, modern people in Shanghai. And somebody says, "What do you think about what's going on in Hong Kong?" And the answer he gives you is, "Oh, I don't know anything about going on in Hong Kong. Naturally, I know nothing about what's going on in Hong Kong. I don't know what you're talking about," and he moves on, okay? That guy knows everything about Hong Kong. And when he says, "I know nothing," if he says to me, "I know Hong Kong is a small city in southern China," then you'd be suspicious. But since he says, "I know nothing about Hong Kong," it means that everybody in Shanghai is following Hong Kong, which means that Chinese leadership is acting in regard to Hong Kong exclusively from the point of view of impact on China itself. The reason why, now, there are limits, of course. The Hong Kong Police Department, Hong Kong is still a place where there are actually English officers in the police, and there are foreign judges and things. So Hong Kong is, whatever the degree of Beijing influence over the leader in Hong Kong, the leader is very constrained. There are many things he cannot do. But as you also know, in recent years, Chinese police don't shoot in China itself. There are riots, people overthrow police car, set it on fire, and the police doesn't shoot. And what I mean, the police that has weapons, that is, they call the PAP, the People's Armed Police. They don't shoot. So in other words, there are Hong Kong constraints to what you can do. And in China itself, now they are still shooting Uyghur. They are beating Tibetans. But with the Han, they're not shooting. And you can, numerous riots, quite violent, police doesn't shoot. So we have a bunch of dictators in Beijing who are terrified by the fact that Hong Kong-type behavior could start any minute, anywhere. Maybe where you expected, downtown Shanghai, among young, hip people. Maybe you'll be totally surprised and be a bunch of people that you consider rural, backwater people who will come out and start saying it. So, to be a democratic prime minister is very bad. You can lose power. To be a non-democratic leader is worse because you can wake up and be, instead of having breakfast, you could be locked up or killed by uprising or whatever. So they're handling Hong Kong. And you can be sure that from the moment the students started in Hong Kong, the available attention time for foreign policy probably declined by 97%, right there. And they're very limited in what they can do. So obviously they applied the strategy called Anaconda, which is very slow constriction. And that is what the press calls it, very slow constriction. I happen to have a ranch, cattle ranch, in Bolivia, in the Amazon, and I have many anacondas. And they don't do that, by the way, members of the press. They don't slowly do it, they do it fast. But never mind. That's what we're trying to do and waiting for people to be tired, to become tired. But every moment, they don't know what will happen. So they're viewing at this point, but as you know, President Ma of Taiwan reacted to Hong Kong by somewhat retreating from his position and kind of saying, supporting Hong Kong and so on. And why was that? Because he realized what it means that the PAP is not shooting in Dali and not shooting in Waichou in these places, that they're not going to shoot in Hong Kong either. So for him, it's extra room of maneuver in regard to extra room of maneuver. And the limitation, this is not the China of Tiananmen. And that's not good. If you're a dictator, people should be afraid of you. And that's another factor in the situation from Hong Kong.
Do I see any more hands? That's Elias. If I don't see any more hands, I'd like to use the chair's prerogative, and I'd like to ask a question from you. What kind of domestic changes would have to take place in China for China to return to the peaceful rise approach towards its neighbors?
Well, I don't know about all of you, but I personally like China very much. And personally, every time I go to China, I am extremely happy to see that less and less people live in dirt and poverty and misery. There were lots of misery in China. So I am very upbeat and positive about everything that's happened and so on and so forth. And now the only question is, will this Communist Party actually undergo the moral collapse it has to undergo to give up power? You know, the Shah of Iran could have stayed, and his son could be ruling Iran today, if he just ordered the guards to open fire. They said, can we open fire on this crowd, smelly crowd in front of the palace? And instead of saying yes, he would not give the order, right? They are going to be in that kind of situation. In a way, they're half there with Hong Kong. And so their line has been, we are a bunch of dictators, and we're very corrupt, but we give you very high-speed growth, 10.5%, 12%. Then the growth rate goes down to 7%, it's still very good, but not good enough to protect the savings of the Chinese who invested in apartments, because there may be 40 million empty apartments. So now they have to have an anti-corruption campaign. You go to the Communist Party and you have to take away the incentive for them to be officials. Why be a bloody official if you can't be corrupt? So now there's an evolutionary process going on. If they don't have 12%, they have 7%. With 7%, they have to give them 7% plus anti-corruption campaign. If it goes to 6%, they'll have to do, I don't know what, make concessions. But clearly, there is no static situation in China. Clearly. Clearly, what's happening in China is a highly dynamic process, and it is going in one particular direction. And either the moment comes where Xi Jinping says, look, I gave life in prison to the Uyghur professor who, that Minzhou University on Huhai, who did nothing except have a website. A very moderate website, by the way, about Uyghur national identity. So they're now, in one level, doing repression. They're not only shooting Uyghur, arresting Uyghur, but they're arresting a lot of Chinese human rights leaders, political types. They're also using the anti-corruption campaign to hit a group of politically dangerous people. But that situation is evolving day by day. There's a highly unstable environment. So what I think all historical precedent shows that serious analysts will never get it right, because the event that changes everything always comes from outside the sphere where serious analysts look at. For example, the morning when the Xunlanhai, the leaders woke up in Beijing with the Xunlanhai surrounded by the Falun Gong followers. Okay, 10,000 Falun Gong holding hands all around the leadership. They didn't realize Falun Gong was highly organized and had penetrated the police, so much that the police let them do it. I mean, the Beijing city mice, you know. So we are watching not a machine turning, but something like a bomb. Except we will never be able to guess. You know, it's like the Bastille in France, you know. The word spread that the Bastille prisoners were going to be executed, all 5,000 of them. And so the mob comes out. Actually, there were 7 prisoners, including the Marquis de Sade. There were 7, and by the way, they were treated extremely well, rather overfed. But that's how it happened in the French Revolution. And you're going to get something like that.
You have a follow-up question? Yes, okay, go ahead. Sure. Right.
Is there not a danger that a democratic China could be a more nationalistic China? Not with not this kind of policy with looking for supremacy without weapon, more looking for supremacy with weapon. Is this not a danger?
Right. In other words, like all Americans believe in democracy, I'm a bit of a nasty character, so I actually testified before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee prior to the 2003 war, saying if you remove Saddam, you will not get a beautiful democracy, you'll get a lot of fighting between Shia and with Shia and Sunni and so forth. So I'm fully aware of the fact that democracy in China could unleash the popular sentiment of people who still have 150 years of humiliation to get out, and anger, including anger at suffering at the hands of fellow Chinese, that they can, you know. I'm fully aware of that, and it is a very serious observation, has to be taken seriously. However, even if that fully happens in the worst scenario, democracy will bring automatically something else, and that is decentralization. It is very unnatural. It takes a very strong dirigist control for Sichuan people and Guangdong people not to have a voice. Okay, decentralization. A democratic China will become a decentralizing China with many power centers, like in any other place, the Federal Republic of Germany, the Federal Republic of the United States. It's natural. Democracy means federalism. Even in unitary places like France, you have separatist movements in Britain, and in England, as you know, the United Kingdom almost ceased to exist just a short time ago, right? So, yes, there'll be an angry China, but B, a decentralized China. And C, given the golden platinum palaces, ruby-encrusted palaces of the military, they might be very angry, but they will now want to spend more on the military, but less. So all of these factors come with democracy. Maybe anger, a revenge, but also cut the budget, also decentralize. All of these things will come, and the proportion of them will depend on a day that democracy comes, because every day there is less resentment. Every day there are more people who understand, who are if you like, pro-American, even pro-Japanese in many ways. I remember the Chinese popular mass reaction to the 1911 earthquake and tsunami. Okay, a shopkeeper near the hotel, which I used to go in Beijing, put up a big sign, handmade sign, saying how beautiful it is that such a horrible huge earthquake could take place in such a small country. And then this guy was barraged on the Chinese internet by people saying the Japanese are human beings, how dare you say that, how could you think that, and so on. Then the Chinese started broadcasting pictures of Japanese people queuing up for the fixed line phones. and saying, oh, look, discipline and so on. Then broadcast about schools, that everything was destroyed in Kesennumene except the school, because the school is publicly built, etc., etc. In other words, a democratic China will also include a lot of people who will resist nationalist things. All of these things will happen. In other words, once you remove the machine of dictatorship, you get real China. And real China is 1,000 things, not one.
Thank you very much. That is definitely an optimistic note on which to end. Unless we have some other pressing questions. I don't see any hands. Thank you very much. Oh, there's one. There's a hand. Do I see a hand? Ah, yes, there's a hand. Thank you. Sorry. Please come and ask a question.
Makoto Honjo, associate. A couple of weeks ago, we had Ian Braymer over here giving his take of the world. And he was saying that Asia was looking at very smooth sailing, more or less, because China, Japan, and India had very stable governments, which had a lot of support from their populace. And I think it might be a different in the time horizons between you and Mr. Braymer, that you seem, your presentation seems to give an idea that China is probably going to have to change in the long during some sort of time horizon, whereas Mr. Braymer was feeling that it would be smooth sailing for the time being. And would you like to comment on that issue, please?
Actually, Mr. Braymer is a very elegant guy who lives in a very elegant house up the road from my street. And his garden is kept much better than mine. He also was given another garden to look after, which was Iraq, He was sent to Iraq to make democracy in Iraq. I don't think that garden is so beautiful. But when it comes to Asia, that's another Braymer who's speaking. And that is the Braymer who worked for many years as Kissinger Associates. That's right. And he still works with Kissinger Associates. And Kissinger Associates has a unidimensional picture of Asia. In that picture, China and the United States will naturally converge under G2. They will make all the agreements between them. They will settle everything. India and Japan and all the other countries will find their own place within this architecture between Beijing and Washington. Now, this is Dr. Kissinger's old détente idea with the Soviet Union. Détente, he became famous for that, which he propagated when he was Secretary of State. He last propagated it, however, some time ago, a long time ago, under President Ford. And the result of his advocacy of détente was that he lost his job and was fired. He never had another public job since. The Chinese have never noticed this fact about his biography, which is that he proposed G2 before, and then proposed it between Moscow and Washington. President Ford had to fire him and replace him with some very undistinguished person to be Secretary of State, because he was running into an election. And the American people absolutely were not interested in détente. Détente meant coexistence, which means accepting the Soviet system. And they said, no, we do not want to coexist with the Soviet system. We don't want to coexist with them. We don't want to recognize them. But that is what Kissinger proposed. His book on China ends with a sort of invocation for G2. Beijing and Washington settle everything, and these other countries find a spot in it. And I believe that Mr. Braymer, being focused on the Middle East, is a nice guy, and he's not stupid at all. But nevertheless, I think he accepts this office view of it. The problem is that the other Americans don't. Other Americans absolutely do not want to coexist with Politburo by China ruled by 7 people wearing identical suits with identical haircuts. If only when they made the standing committee photograph, they would have, one of them had done what they do in Harajuku and made his hair blonde, that could have made a big difference to American point of view. But all of them be perfectly black hair, that was it.
Okay. I think that's it for now. Thank you very much, and please do come back again, and please accept this honorary membership at the press club.
Honorary or real?
Thank you.